It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality. I'm your host, Bianca. With me always is Christy Powell.
Howdy.
And today we are joined by Frank Zindler. Frank is a former president of American Atheists, esteemed counter-apologetics debater, former editor of the American Atheist magazine, and director of American Atheists Press. He's also written multiple books, including the series Through Atheist Eyes and his newest work, out now on Amazon, Confessions of a Born-Again Atheist, The Implausible Lives of a Godless Guy. At his 80th birthday party last year, which I had the honor of attending, Frank read us some passages from this memoir, and as he read, it became clear that the event was doubling as a coming-out party, something I was very excited about and touched at being included in. We'll talk a little bit about that with Frank, of course, as well as his new book and his views of the intersection of secularism and sexuality in just a minute. But first, if you or a loved one has come out as an atheist, as a member of the GRSM community, as anything, please call in and tell us about it. Today, we're celebrating leaving the closet. The number, as always, is 512-686-0279. That's 512-686-0279. Frank, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much for asking me to do this.
I'm so excited to finally have you on. I know we've been talking about this for a little while.
Well, I know you've got other things, too, that have to be done.
Always more things to do. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Frank.
Well, as my book explains, I was born an atheist, like everyone. But unfortunately, I believe I also was born gay. Well, I say unfortunately, that was how I felt for many years.
Sure.
At this point, I'm slowly evolving a different take on that. But anyway, for most of my life, it was an unfortunate idea. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how to say. I was born into a very different world. I tried to learn how to plow with a horse. I can remember hearing Adolf Hitler broadcasting from Germany during World War II. I remember growing up on a farm which had no indoor plumbing. It was a very, very different world, and I do recapture a lot of that in my memoirs. By the way, my book is, in a sense, it's an autobiography in the form of 29 separate memoirs. Mm-hmm. Each of the memoirs either captures one of my different lives, some of my secret lives, some of my public lives, or in a few cases, slightly different aspects of the same life. Mm-hmm. I tried to keep repetition to a minimum, and I think there isn't very much repetition, but there are a few places where I had to repeat some things in order to make things clear as to how everything fit together.
Well, I just love that part of the title, the implausible lives, plural.
Yeah, well,
it's
Godless
Guy.
Yeah,
I think that's fascinating.
And I mean, some of them are really, really weird. In fact, some of the stories about my life as a hypnotist, both as a hypnotherapist and as an experimental hypnotist, at least one of them is so implausible that it's not a story I told to anybody except my family and a few very close friends who were familiar with my work in hypnosis. And that's the story Messing with the Mob, about
I remember you reading
how hypnosis saved my life in an encounter with the Chicago mob. And
yes, honestly, if you
way to
just
tease
get the
it,
book,
yeah, everybody wants it now.
I had the pleasure of having you read that chapter to me, I believe, and literally, if you buy the book just for that story, it's worth it. It's so good.
Buy it for that memoir, keep it for the other 26.
Well, Kirkus actually had some really nice things to say about your book. They said that Zindler is a sharp, personable presence on the page.
Yeah.
Sorry for all the plosives. to the audio guy. Drawing on his experiences as an evolutionary biologist, a prominent atheist, and a gay man who spent the majority of his life in the closet, he examines the battles that he's waged to free people from what he sees as the oppressive influence of the Bible. Throughout his book, Zindler's prose is energetic, humane, and engaging, often revealing long-ago feelings as if they're happening at that moment. His tales of his activist days are particular standouts.
That's remarkably kind. I mean, that's really strong words. Sounds like a great
I
read.
can't tell you how relieved I was with that review. I have known of Kirkus reviews since I was in high school as an assistant librarian, a student librarian, and we got the printed journal, Kirkus Reviews, and the librarian would use the reviews in that magazine to determine what would be bought for the library.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like having your own entry in the dictionary. It's to me anyway, it was so wonderful to get that really good review.
Oh, certainly. Kirkus is a leader in the book review field, and if you get a good review from them, you're kind of set. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this particular book. What about it felt timely and important? And what do you hope that it's going to say to the rest of the world?
Yeah. Okay. Let me try to take those apart. For one thing, part of it was my daughter Catherine, who knew so many of the stories that are in the book. And she thought that I should write my memoirs. Well, she called it my autobiography, but anyway, I couldn't figure out how to write an autobiography in chronological order. So that's why it is the way it is. There are flash forwards, flashbacks, and all this sort of thing. But perhaps more important than her prodding, although that was very important, was this sense of guilt that I had spent so many years. I started writing it when I was 78. And the sense of guilt for not because of being gay. I had long ago come to terms with that, and my very close friends, well, certainly my family all knew about me, but my colleagues at work did not know. And of course, as I explained, Madeline Murray O'Hare did not know. And so I felt that I had been deceiving people for so long. And that was the guilt that I felt. And I thought, well, I just have to come clean. And I had really just painted myself into a closet, into a corner. There were so many reasons why I couldn't come out of the closet, and finally I just, as they say, I had to bite the bullet. I tried. In fact, that was a really difficult memoir to write, the very first one. My confessions begin the book, because as hard as I worked, I could not come to a conclusion to come up with a decent explanation about why I was waiting so long to come out of the closet publicly. And so finally I just had to say, okay, this is it. And I did it, as you know, I invited 110 of my closest friends for a birthday dinner party. 103 managed to come. 7 of them were sick or in the hospital, or both. I guess if you're in the hospital, you're normally sick. But anyway, that was repetitiously redundant, I think. Anyway, so that was, those were the things. And getting back to Catherine, she remembered a lot of things that I had actually forgotten about. For example, she was who reminded me of my encounter with Elvis Presley. I had long ago forgotten about that, but she remembered that. And so she helped in recouping a lot of memories, stories that I had told her when she was a girl, but that had not been in my mind for a long time. As far as timely, more than being timely, it was sort of being, it's about time. You know? And I think that as far as important is concerned, it was important to me because I just had to get all these things off my chest. Plus, as I write, I think in the introduction or something like that, I felt that some of the worlds that I recount, like life on the farm, plowing with a horse, and making our own soap and all this kind of stuff, I mean, that is a lost world, but it's a world that doesn't deserve oblivion. And some of the characters that I recount and talk about in the book, some of my family members, my English teacher, Miss Williams, who has a great, enormous section in the thing. It's not very many people write lengthy memoirs centering upon their English teacher from high school, but if you read the book, you'll certainly understand why she was important. Although that did allow me to recount a very funny story about meeting Aldous Huxley, who was her idol, and this was at the very dawning of the age of psychedelic drugs. And he was giving a lecture in Chicago, and I had to drive Miss Williams to hear him. And what I didn't realize was that he was stoned out of his gourd on mescaline. And imagine trying to, first of all, understand a lecture being given by somebody on mescaline. And then I managed to get to the reception area before everybody else. and I tried to carry on a conversation with him, and it was really, really bizarre. I can't really summarize it here, but I think I did a good job of recapturing the experience in the book called Driving Miss Williams.
Oh, I love that. I'm sure your English teacher also was pleased by that reference.
Yeah, well, of course, she died many, many years ago, and she had become, I had become part of her, well, her entire family by the time she had retired here to Ohio, and so I was her last contact with the outside world. And I actually ended up conducting her memorial service and burial and the whole thing.
Wow. That is a student-teacher bond. That
a beautiful connection, really.
Really.
Well, you know, to give you an idea, I had lost contact with her, and I, of course, had gone on to one college after another. And when I went back to my old high school, she was gone. She seemed extremely old when I was in her class, and I just assumed she was long ago dead. And I was on a radio show here in Columbus on the PBS station, and it was a 2-hour-long call-in show. And the last caller was Miss Williams.
Oh my goodness!
Wow.
And so she went on to tell the audience how brilliant I was. But then when she died, I got a call from her lawyer that I was mentioned in her will, and of course I thought that's likely because I had been her complete ombudsman and contact with the outside world. But what I was astounded was she had left me $40,000 in her will. An English teacher, imagine this. But that was incredible enough, but she actually, that was in the codicil to the will. The will itself had been written in the mid-1960s when she couldn't have known that I was alive or not. And at that time, she left me $20,000, and then she doubled it after we were reunited. Imagine that.
That's remarkable.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you've talked. Seriously, this book is amazing. Everybody go get it.
There's a lot of. I'm just getting bits and pieces
so
here.
Much.
There's Huxley. There's Elvis. There's a lot going on.
Huxley. You're really good at giving us just enough to make us interested, and then being very coy about it. So you've talked a little bit about the more challenging parts of writing the book, because you said you opened with your confessions and you kind of were talking about how it was difficult to summarize the reasons why and where you're coming from.
Yeah.
How about some of the more enjoyable parts? What were some of the things that really felt cathartic?
Well, actually, those parts were very easy for the most part, of course. Things like writing about messing with the mob, and the episode losing someone else's mind, and the story about how my great-grandmother became unhinged upon her first encounter with the radio.
Yes, I remember that one too.
And my most embarrassing experience with Eleanor Roosevelt, of all people. And by the way, I have to read this to you. This isn't on your request, but there, on the back cover, it says, question: what do Adolf Hitler, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Elvis Presley, George H.W. Bush, Larry Flint, John DeLorean, Isaac Asimov, Aldous Huxley, Leonard Bernstein, and Madeleine Murray O'Hare have in common? Answer: all their lives intersect the life of Frank R. Zindler in the pages of this book.
All right.
That'll sell some
There are a
copies.
lot.
Right,
Yeah,
that'll sell a little
absolutely.
bit. You've basically covered the board. Anybody who's interested in any of them.
Western Civ in the last 100 years.
Right?
Yeah.
Amazing. All right. We are going to jump to a couple of calls.
Okay.
We are going to talk a little bit with David in Washington. Hi, David. How are you this evening?
I'm great. How are you guys doing?
Doing good. What can we help you with tonight?
So, I was a virgin when I got married. I was 24 years old, I think. Can't remember. Anyways, I deconverted in my early 30s, and the reason being a virgin was because we were both very, very religious.
Sure.
Graduates of the purity movement, so to speak. We have 2 children now, and I'm still feeling the effects of the sexual repression and expressing that.
Mm-hmm.
My wife's still very Christian, and she's raising our kids to be that too.
Mm.
So there's some tension and opposition on my half. I feel really cheated out of exploring my sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And I've communicated that with her, and she doesn't seem very interested. Which prompted me to look outside my marriage to find sexual attention and fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I view marriage now is way different than my youth. And the prospect of quiet, vanilla sex for the remainder of my life is quite horrifying.
Sure.
So I feel like I was denied an expression of an important part of who I am. And I'm trying to work through that. And I'm just looking to see some advice on how to navigate this space.
Yeah, those are incredibly human experiences. I mean, wanting to mourn prom sex and dorm sex and, making out at a high school dance and these things that are often really awful, but are quintessentially human for many, many of us. I think there really is something to mourn there. And so giving yourself permission just at the start to feel those feelings and to have some frustration, some anger, some sorrow, all of that is really human and I think really natural and worth spending a little bit of time with. What would you say beyond that, V?
I would say that making sure that you are being open and communicative with your partner, even if they don't seem to be interested in these conversations. I would say that as you're exploring this, be honest about what you need, honest about what you want. And I would say if at all possible, avoid going behind someone's back or going outside of previously agreed upon boundaries without, a lot of prior warning. just because I know that I've been on the opposite end of that, and that's never a fun thing. But yeah, I think I can empathize with you a whole lot. I grew up super religious, super conservative, super homeschooled, prom sex, dorm sex, making out in high school, like none of that. No, that was not part of my experience either. So I also feel kind of a loss just for that discomfort that other people can bond over, if nothing else. But yeah, I think that you are valid in your concerns, and I think that if you are looking into the future and you see something you don't like, it is your prerogative to change that and take those steps, and that's not something you should be sorry about. I would just caution that it is approached with as much openness and honesty as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely want to give Frank and you a chance to jump in, but I guess I would just kind of echo that and say that, is cheating permissible? Is it immoral? Is it unethical? I'm not going to make a blanket statement. I am going to say it can be incredibly hurtful and is generally not the thing that you want to do and is not really the person that you likely want to be. Is it excusable in certain circumstances? Perhaps, when people are trapped in a marriage because of insurance, because of obligation, because of children, because of caregiving, because of these different things. If you need to do something in order to stay in this marriage and stay sane, that may be permissible, but by and large, I think that you have a right to renegotiate this relationship. And because you are seeing marriage as a very different concept than you did 10, 15 years ago, you have the right to renegotiate it and sort of an obligation to do so, and to do so in good faith, which means open and honest, maybe not leading with all of this right out the gate. I'm sure y'all have had conversations, but it is important that, to the best of your ability, that you're proceeding honestly and expressing those things in a way that gives her the right to make her own decision, so you're not stealing those choices from her. Right.
To quote a favorite regular on the show, Marie Delafont, it's about personal autonomy. You have every right with your body to do with as you wish, as long as you are not violating the autonomy of other people. So walking that boundary is not always easy, but
absolutely,
that's kind of how I take my cues from that. Frank, do you have any concepts for this?
Can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
One of the things that I would suggest might help, actually, the big problem, as I see this Dave has, is that there's little communication, or the communication channels are too narrow. They're not wide enough to get these things solved. What I would strongly recommend would be to find a non-religious marriage counselor. And I stress that the importance of it not being a religious counselor, that somebody really trained in psychology, and specifically in marriage kinds of things. Not that person is going to solve the problems, but that kind of a forum will allow some of these things to be brought out in a non-adversarial way. The counselor asks, what do you think about this? Or what is your problem with that? And a three-way discussion is usually a lot easier than a two-way discussion. I would strongly recommend, though, that you avoid so-called Christian psychologists or Christian marriage counselors, because they will only exacerbate the problems. They're, I think, scientifically not playing with a full deck. So, but I think that in order to try to open or to widen the communication channel, it would be probably a good idea if you can afford it. I don't have any idea how expensive this might be, but if you can afford that, I would recommend that.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does any of that resonate for you? I know it may not sound like maybe what you were searching for.
It was helpful. The thing that I'm concerned about is the children.
Sure.
I feel like it's almost better just to suffer silently for that case. But I don't want to regret anything.
Yeah.
And I hear that, and that, stay together for the kids mentality is something we hear about a lot. And I certainly, as a stranger on the internet, am not going to step in and tell you how to live your life, what to do with your wife, how to speak to your kids. But my opinion, since you're calling and since you're asking, is that if you are living this sort of double life, if you are telling your kids, on the one hand, we have this happy, healthy marriage, this happy, healthy family, this wonderful life, while suffering in silence, while being miserable on the inside, while living a life that doesn't match up with what you're telling them and what you're expressing to them, they're going to internalize that. Now, I'm not saying they are going to sniff out your lies or know that that's not true, but when we get these discordant messages, that what we used to call schizophrenic messaging, where on one level or on one channel, we're hearing, oh, everything's wonderful, but on a lower frequency, everything is not wonderful, that can cause a lot of stress and tension and take years and years to work out. So I don't mean to make it sound like your best option is also terrible, because I know that this is a really tricky place to be, but I want to make sure that you're making this decision in an informed way, because faking it and kind of going through the motions in that way is going to leave you miserable, if that's your case. And I don't want to make it sound as if this is a terrible, terrible marriage, because I don't know and I don't mean to imply. But I would caution you about being willing to take on this suffering for their sake, because it may not actually help them or serve them in the long run.
I hear you, and I can appreciate the viewpoint. I've had just one last thing before I let you guys go, but I've had a difficult time looking for examples to draw from somebody who has been married a long time and then deconverted, and then the other spouse is still highly religious. And I just wanted to hear different viewpoints of those examples, and I was wondering if you could point me in the right direction to look some of those up.
Yeah, I think a great place to start would be checking out our Discord. We have a very active community of people at the ACA who interact on that platform. And I'm sure, I am 100% positive you are not the only one who dealt with that within this group of people. So if you just wanted to go on there and start a conversation, there are other people on that channel who have had the similar experiences. Another thing you could try is, I know the Recovering from Religion Foundation has a hotline that is utilized by people who are going through the process of deconversion, and whether that's personal doubts and fears or whether that's interpersonal struggles, they're there to help with that. It's kind of like prayer, but with somebody actually on the other end. So if you want to check that out, I'm sure that you are not the first person to call with that exact scenario as well.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you guys' time and your thoughts and opinions. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for calling.
Yeah, and before we move on, I guess I just want to take a moment to acknowledge how impossible that situation can feel.
Yeah.
And, on the one hand, he was asking us, do we have any recommendations for a book or a movie or something about somebody who's been in this position? And my mind does draw a blank, in large part because I haven't written my memoirs yet.
Yeah, right?
There's certainly lots of us who have gone through these types of experiences, and I'm sure that there will be a number of great recommendations, so I'm hoping that y'all can flood the comment section and let us know what you have to say, because I know that there are certainly a lot of people in the audience who are either currently or have been in this exact situation, so I just want to make sure that David knows he's in good company.
Let's go to Sarah in Georgia.
Okay.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. What can we help you with?
So I wanted to get some perspectives on, so let me backtrack. I'm an atheist. I was raised in a very conservative Christian family. I went to Christian school my whole life, was taught some really unhealthy things about sex. And now that I'm an adult, and I have, I've engaged in sexual experiences and stuff, and I've, tried to get a more healthy perspective on sex. I'm still living with a lot of guilt and kind of unhealthy perspectives on things. Like, for instance, I've had multiple sexual partners, and I grew up a lot, thinking that sex was only for marriage, and that, if you have sex with more than one person, you're, a chewed-up piece of gum, that kind of thing. We had that, kind of a metaphor, I think, that they taught our class. So I know logically that that's, societal, religious attitudes that don't reflect on my worth, but I still struggle with those feelings sometimes. So I wanted to kind of see if I could get some perspective on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're in that position where maybe your visceral reaction, your body doesn't react the same way as your mind or the way you think about things more linearly. If you lay it out logically and you know what's right, but it still just comes wrapped up in all of these gross feelings, usually the most important step is to just spend a lot of time there, as unpleasant as that sounds, to feel that discomfort and race towards it a little bit. And you can do that in slow and systematic ways as necessary, but it really is about exposure. So spending time listening to podcasts like this one, getting into the books and the movies and the things that are going to promote a sex-positive worldview, because you've spent years and years and years and are still living in a society that's so incredibly sex-negative and giving you all of these messages about how someone like you is a slut, is a monster, is sinning against her own body, and these kinds of things. And the best way to combat that really is to spend time hearing some of those other messages. And if it feels a little uncomfortable to, listen to something like this or the Savage Love Cast or something along those lines, as people are talking about sex so casually and carefree, it'll get more comfortable with time. So that's certainly where I would start.
Yeah, I would suggest doing some research into statistics and figuring out exactly how many sex partners the average person has. And I know Cut, the YouTube channel Cut, does this great 100 people answer different questions. And one of them was, how many sex partners have you had? And it goes from 0 to like in the hundreds. And it's fascinating to watch people just say how many sexual partners they've had, tell that body count totally. You see people who are sheepish and people who are absolutely like proud about it. And it's a really interesting way to look at that. Even if you wanted to like jump on Twitter and do a Twitter poll, like how many sex partners have you had? Answer in the comments. I guarantee you, like whatever your number is, there are at least 100,000 people with that same number, and then the majority of them are higher. So I think that sorry, go ahead.
I just think that essentially, I think Chris was on a good point there. Essentially, what is needed is desensitization to something that is strange and previously foreign, and but again, the only solution to desensitization, as Chris says, is try to find different ways to encounter this, maybe in less threatening ways. I'm not quite sure how that might be, but the more you can expose yourself to these ideas of what constitutes so-called normal sexuality, as opposed to super Christian sexuality, which is essentially not sexuality at all.
Right.
Procreation, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So.
Does that help at all?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's I can't remember the name of the person who just said this. Sorry, I'm familiar with V. I'm not familiar with
It's okay.
Don't stress it. You're on the line with Christy and Frank, but yeah.
I'm just over here preening. It's fine.
If I may add one last thing there. Growing up in a fundamentalist or ultra-conservative Christian home, and with homeschooling and all that sort of thing, your universe, which seems large to you, is extremely, maybe excruciatingly small compared to the universe of people who are not so reared. And so you're going to be encountering so many things that clash and just don't fit into the universe in which you grew up. And I realize that can be frightening. Again, the only solution is to try as much as possible to expand your universe, not just in sexuality, but the more you learn about how people in the outside world react to all sorts of other things, there's sort of a cumulative effect in desensitizing yourself to all these other novel things, as well as sexual things.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. It's interesting as you were saying that. I was thinking that, when I hear people talk about sex, I don't slut shame anybody else but myself. It is solely like just a personal thing. Like, I am super sex positive about everyone but me, and so I feel like maybe moving forward, kind of, continuing to listen, continuing to expose myself to different viewpoints will help me kind of internalize the attitude I have towards others. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
That makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. And, there are so many great sex positive just brands out there and different media that you can experiment with and things that feel good. I mentioned the Savage Lovecast as I often do, in large part because for me, it was incredibly transformative. Listening to that for, on a weekly basis for a year basically is my deconversion story, or at least the chapter in it. So I recommend that, but also Bedpost Confessions is coming to mind. They've appeared on our show. They have an incredible product, and they are just starting the second season of their podcast. And what's beautiful there is the incredible intimacy of those stories. And so you're not tempted to sort of like, well, that's some creepy weirdo, or, you're able to really listen and get into people's heads. And these are people of all different stripes. I mean, the remarkable diversity of the types of folks that they have telling their stories, I think will open your eyes and, as Frank said, just expand your universe dramatically. So those are two of my recommendations, but definitely just get out there and recognize that if you are slut-shaming yourself, for lack of a better term, if you are having those feelings of guilt and grief, we certainly don't want that for you, but I also want you to know it's okay. It's not your fault that it's happening. It doesn't mean that you aren't sex positive enough, that you're not trying hard enough, that there's something wrong with you as a humanist or as an atheist or as a human being. It's okay to have those feelings, and it may take a little bit of time for them to fade away, and that's all right.
Thank you so much. That's a really great perspective. I love what you guys are doing. Keep it up.
Hey,
Thank you
thanks
so much, Sarah.
Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Oh my gosh, I can relate to that. A couple more creators online that I love for sex positivity is Just Between Us, which is Gabby Dunn and Allison Raskin, and then also Kelsey Darrow. They have podcasts where they talk about all these different aspects of sexuality, especially from a AFAB perspective. So that definitely helped me a lot as I was starting to figure out gender identity and polyamory and all of these things. So yeah, definitely check that out. We are going to jump back into the interview with you, Frank. But first, I am told that Barbara Williams and Daryl Ray are watching tonight.
Oh, wow.
So they say hi.
Hi. I'm happy to I'm happy to hear their names.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the coming out process. We've heard a couple of people on the lines today talk about the struggle and that internal kind of trauma that they've had to go through. And I know that you said that when you were at a young age, you also battled with this kind of despair at realizing you were quote unquote different, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I feel that I was literally marked in the womb to be gay. My mother nearly died of kidney failure while she was pregnant with me. And I read many, many years ago an article in Scientific American about experiments with rats. And they showed that when a pregnant rat, the mother, was injected with female hormones, that during a critical period, it wasn't just at any time, it had to be during a very critical period during brain development, that the male pups exhibited female behavior when they went through puberty. And the reverse experiment was also done, that pregnant rats injected with testosterone during that same critical period for brain development, the female pups, those that were chromosomally female, exhibited male behavior. And so I think that was kind of how I was biased, literally, in the womb. My earliest gay memory, although it wasn't consciously gay at the time, but it certainly showed this. I was 4 years old, and my mother was bathing me in front of the pot-bellied stove in the dining room of the farmhouse. And it was winter, and so it was very cold. But just out of the blue, this was during World War II, you understand. Out of the blue, I announced that I wanted to undress a sailor boy or a soldier boy. And mother said, this was kind of unusual because she was not really religious, but she said, oh, Jesus wouldn't like that. And very matter-of-factly, I said, well, I'd like to undress Jesus too.
He's got great abs.
Oh.
And then when I was 5 and in kindergarten for Halloween, my mother made me a Little Bo Peep costume with hoop skirt and the whole business. And I just was so happy to be able to dress up as Little Bo Peep in that dress. And basically, mother had a daughter. She had confessed early on that she really was disappointed that she'd had a boy, that she wanted a girl. And so that also, I think, perhaps ties in with my development. But I think it was more the prenatal marking, if you will. But then my next memory was at the age, well, yeah, a little bit later than that, dressing up in my grandmother's dressing gown. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who basically supported me in most everything. And I'm not sure at all that he was actually trying to hurt me. But he said, well, let's go show you off at the store. My great uncle Harold had a country store. And so my grandfather got me into the truck and drove me up to the store. And I remember in the store, all of a sudden, everybody laughing at me. I was still 4 years old, I'm pretty sure. And I didn't know why they were laughing at me, but I just felt ashamed of myself. And I didn't know what shame really was. I could only feel it. And I remember crawling up on a low shelf underneath the cash register counter where they piled newspapers. And I just pulled the dress up around me and formed a cocoon and just cried and cried. And then one last episode, when I was 8, we had visitors from Chicago, and there was a big, no, I was 6, and Marvin was 8. He was a big boy from Chicago. And we had a lot of fun on the farm. And that night we had to sleep together in the same bed. And we talked and talked after lights out. And I told him, I want to marry you. and I said, when we grow up, I want to marry you. And he wasn't startled by that, but he kind of weighed it and so on. And he said, I don't think boys are allowed to marry boys. I think they can only marry girls. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, I don't know. That's just the way it is. Well, that's a stupid rule. Yeah. So, but then, of course, when I started school, I was the victim of all the bullies. Mm-hmm. And the biggest part of being gay was not any self-recognition or acceptance of oneself. It was the problem of at least in my case, it was the problem of dealing with the bullies. And I mean, this was quite nasty at times. One time, they threw a lighted firecracker down the back of my neck and my shirt and things like that. And so it was pretty horrible. And then, of course, the other problem, as I write in my memoirs, in Michigan, when I was growing up, homosexuality, or crimes against nature, as they were called in the law, could allow for up to life imprisonment. And that was the same penalty as the penalty for first-degree murder. Michigan never has had the death penalty. And so basically in Michigan law, just for being who I was equivalent to a murderer. And to try to figure that out, that made the problem of trying to have a justifiable self-image when legally you are a felon. That I never really ever got over, truthfully.
I wouldn't imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a thing nobody who hasn't gone through this thinks about this aspect of it, right? The internalized trauma of having to deal with the way other people see you.
Right. And I guess, a large part, not the only thing, but a large part of why it took me so long to publicly come out of the closet was just the residue of this fear that I had, up long past when I got married at the age of 25. And incidentally, I should mention in this program something that perhaps is very unusual about me, something that was extremely fortunate about me, is that I was married to Anne for 48 years, 2 months, 2 weeks, and 6 hours. And it was a true marriage of love, even though sex was not the big point for me at all. But we had a decent sexual life. For her, I should say. And it was an open marriage, both ways. She didn't have too many other partners during those years, but in the early years, I had quite a few male partners. But still, we bonded together in a way that I've never bonded with any other human being. And so I was just inexpressibly lucky to have married a woman that I genuinely loved. And actually, I guess the most difficult part of my memoirs is the next to the last memoir number 28 called Love's Death, which describes the 5-year struggle to keep Anne alive after she contracted her second breast cancer.
Mm.
That was just horribly difficult to write.
I would imagine. I remember at your 80th birthday, there was a very large picture of the two of you.
Yes,
right next to the podium. Yeah.
Yeah. That painting, by the way, is reproduced in the plates at the center of my memoirs.
Oh, really lovely.
Yeah, in fact, I really need to mention this because this is also one other important reason why I wrote the memoirs. I wanted to get it on the record where the Murray O'Hare family is buried. They are in an unmarked grave in the Onion Creek Cemetery out between Austin and San Antonio. And I have a map and the coordinates of their grave in my book. I don't know whether you're aware, but when their remains were discovered over 5 years after their abduction and murder, Bill Murray, Madeline's older son, who had by then become an evangelist and very wealthy man and sidekick to all the Religion presidents, he claimed their remains. American Atheists tried to get their remains, but not being blood relatives, we had no legal standing to do that. And so Bill got their remains and buried them all in an unmarked grave and stipulated that the cemetery must never allow anybody to know where they were buried or even if they were buried in that cemetery. And if you go there, they will deny that they're there. But he didn't want any possibility of a memorial marker or anything that would allow anybody, any atheist who had a debt really to them, to be able to pay them any honor whatsoever. And Madeline became almost a second mother to me. And I really want the world to know where their remains are. And hopefully that there'll be some way eventually that we can pay them honor.
Mm. I know that you talked a little bit about that at the last American Atheist Conference during your talk. That definitely moved me to tears. So thank you for sharing that. It's extremely traumatic, but it's necessary that we share that story because not enough people know the result of what it was to be an atheist outspoken during that time period.
Yeah.
So talking a little bit about the coming out of the closet process at 80, why did you do it in the way that you did? Why at your 80th birthday? Why 110 people? And what's the reception? What has it been? Have you lost friends? Have you strengthened friendships? How has it affected you?
Well, other than the standing ovation I got at the party, the reactions have been prolonged yawns. In a way, I did it in what probably was the most practical way to do it, to get it out with a whole bunch of people all at once. I mean, if you can imagine what it would be like, and I'm still working full time, okay, as a linguist and editor in the biochemistry department at my company, and imagine now on day one, I go 3 offices down the hall to one of my 3 best male friends. And I say, okay, I've got a confession to make. Okay, why is he doing this? And then the next day I go to another friend and I've got a confession to make. Well, why are you telling me this? What are your intentions here? it was more than I think I could have handled, and it probably would have got me fired on it. So
That's fair.
Yeah, that's why Atom and I, another recent guest, made a video to just go ahead and get that out of the way. But it does raise a question that's been in the back of my mind since we've been speaking, as you were talking about, sort of painting yourself into a corner or into a closet, and feeling sort of trapped in that way. I'm very curious what you think moving forward or in the future, the future of, I guess, coming out really is or should be. It's been a conversation on this show the last 2 years of should we mark National Coming Out Day? Is that something that we should honor? Because we certainly want to honor the people who have the courage and the opportunity to come out and to identify as their true selves. But I also just hate this narrative that it's somehow on the responsibility of people who are queer to acknowledge that to the world. That the assumption that the default is that everybody be straight and cis, and that obligation falls to folks who are already marginalized. So I'm curious, as you just think about the future, a book like this in another 80 years, how you imagine that playing out.
Well, I like to hope that it's, for most people much younger than I,
sure,
it's measurably easier to do that, because I had that long period of, it would have been almost lethal to come out of the closet. Especially being, for 3 years I was a high school teacher, science teacher. Well, can you imagine in the 60s, being a public school teacher and saying, oh, by the way, I'm queer. That certainly would have been.
Yeah, no question.
And then even when I became a college professor in a liberal state, this was upstate New York, even though it was part of the State University of New York system. But still, it was a very conservative area. And I think I ultimately was driven from my post, not because of my being gay, but because I was an atheist activist. After having been an atheist activist for over 20 years at the time. So that gives you some sense of, a fortiori, it was much worse to come out as gay. And if I were a gay atheist, So basically, I kept accumulating all these problems as years went on, and the more I had to deceive people or pretend to be somebody that I wasn't, the harder it became. And then finally, as I say, I just had to bite the bullet. I thought, my goodness, I'm 80 years old. And as I said in the toast, I said, I've packed up nothing special for this trip around the sun, and concluded this may not be my final trip, but there can't be many more. and so it was very simple, if I don't do it now, it may never be possible. So, and no, let's whoever has celebrated an 81st birthday. So actually, that was only my second birthday party that I'd had since childhood. The first party was when I turned 75, and a friend of mine at work said we had to have a party. And she said,
I think that's an intersection that we talk about on the show all the time. It's in the show name. That intersection between sexuality and secularity, and how either one of those words, whether you're gay or queer or atheist or secular, like these words have these really weighty and unfortunately negative connotations to them. And when you put them together, that's like, oh my goodness, double whammy. So yeah, I think that you might be one of the OG secular sexuality pioneers in that way. You kind of made this road for the rest of us by being out and being open and just being who you are. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and I appreciate your gratitude. I'm not sure it's entirely justified, but I appreciate it nevertheless.
We need to remember I don't know, I feel like there's so much that the people who came before us have laid down so that we could be on a show like this and talk about this and not get death threats every day. Not every day.
Well, if I may stop tooting my own horn, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, one of her great purposes in life was to make America a safe place for the A word. And she used the word atheist over and over and over again in every context. And, she was roundly criticized even by other atheists. Well, it is just stirring up the pot too hard. And that's such a negative term and so on. And you still sometimes encounter that. But, now I think really America is largely desensitized to the A word. You see the word atheist or atheist clubs even in junior high schools. To be sure, it's become a bête noire for the religious right, but then, of course, I mean,
of course.
Yeah. But this was so important. And, my book is dedicated both to the Murray O'Hair family and to the heroes of the Stonewall riots, because they started the desensitization to the whole concept of homosexuality, and then ultimately, of course, transsexuality and things like that. I don't know. It's hard to know where things are headed. In the final memoir in my book, the summing up, I feel a little bit pessimistic about the turn to the right that our society has been making, and a third of our fellow citizens lining up to submit to dictatorship with its homophobic and anti-reason, anti-science sentiments. But I'm hopeful that this is not going to last forever, and that we will recover and be able to regain the progress that we have made so steadily during my lifetime.
And in the meantime, we keep saying the words, right?
Exactly.
And keep the lights on. Just being here at the Atheist Community of Austin, talking about homosexuality and, getting the word queer out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Speaking of keeping the lights on, you guys, we don't normally do this on Secular Sexuality, but we do have Patreon. So if you are interested in helping us out and helping to keep the lights on and helping us to, coast through maybe some choppy waters into smoother sailing, that's something that we always appreciate, and it's what helps us do what we do. So I think we're going to jump into an email super quick, and then wrap up.
Yeah, so super quick might be the wrong term for this email. A note to all of the wonderful folks who are calling in, who are leaving us voicemails, who are sending emails. We love it. We want to see more of it. We're super appreciative. We may need to cut down some of your emails, so please don't be offended as we sort of edit for time and everything else. And as you're writing that email, think about, how maybe this is going to play on air.
Right.
So again, we very much appreciate you. But jumping in, this is an email from Idaho. When I first realized I was non-monogamous, I was racked with anxiety, fear, depression, and doubt. Still, the more I thought about it, the more true it seemed. Unlike my deconversion, it wasn't based in objective logic. It was all subjective and emotional, making it hard to validate that it's real. Sometimes I feel like I should question its validity. I eventually spoke to a therapist who helped me accept what I was feeling, and I felt better, but I still needed to talk to my wife. I had some hopes about being able to reach an understanding. My wife is also an atheist and identifies as asexual. It didn't go well. The backlash against me immediately had me downplaying my non-monogamous identity and trying to backpedal. We went to a marriage counselor. My feelings were eventually explained away as normal male urges and a result of a midlife crisis. I didn't really agree, but it was more important to me to try and maintain my relationship with my wife than to stick up for my newfound identity. I thought if I stopped thinking I was non-monogamous and wrote it off as a fantasy, I could go back to normal. And the feeling that I'm non-monogamous didn't go away. Now, knowing that I had to hide this part of me, I started feeling depressed and anxious. I still do, and I'm on antidepressants for it. As a form of relief, I've started writing out erotic fantasies in secret and posting them anonymously online. Occasionally, some women who read and enjoy my stories will flirt with me, and I'll flirt back. I know it's immoral, but it's exciting and satisfies that urge to be non-monogamous. My wife tries to be more sexual, but it doesn't suit her. It mostly comes off as forced and awkward. She asks if I still have non-monogamous thoughts. If I'm honest, she gets depressed, so I feel like I have to lie. She's become really possessive during sex, which has become a huge turnoff for me. Most concerning is that lately I've been having trouble getting erect. I love my wife and find her attractive, but my genitals don't want to cooperate. I can still get erect with porn, but even that's becoming less effective. At this point, I don't know what to do.
That is
Wow.
a lot.
My goodness.
Yeah, it's certainly heavy material, and I guess I just want to start by saying that as a therapist who specifically works with non-monogamous couples, and everywhere on my website that it says partner, it's like partner parenthesis S, and I very much go out of my way to make non-monogamous folks feel welcome in my practice. I hear all the time where people will come in and say, yeah, we went to a marriage counselor and they said that we were just horn dogs or that we were just sluts or we were just monsters. It's really frustrating to me as a license holder, as a person in this field, to know that there are so many bad therapists out there. So, you mentioned freedom from religion or recovering from religion. And I just want to again point out the Secular Therapy Project as an incredible resource for folks who are looking for somebody in their area that can help avoid some of these pitfalls. But what else? I mean, there's so much going on here.
There is quite a lot. One thing that I'm wondering, and this might be a place to start. A lot of the time, and this is based off of one email, so I don't know how much else is going on or what conversations you have not had. But one thing that I would suggest is if writing erotic fiction and flirting with people online is satisfying that non-monogamous urge by itself, would that be something that you and your wife could meet on in the middle, at least in the short term? I know for a lot of people, when they hear I'm non-monogamous or I want an open relationship or to be poly, they hear you're not enough, I want to go sleep with other people tomorrow.
Sure.
And that's not necessarily what that means. So it could be that if you were to say, I want to experiment in this way that isn't going to affect our sex life, or I'm not going to go out and sleep with the next person I see. I want to flirt anonymously online once in a while. That might be a way to kind of bridge that gap a little bit.
Sure. And I guess I want to back up a little bit and just maybe contextualize some of this for people. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but for anybody who's scratching their head right now about some of this, I have to point out that a lot of folks may not see non-monogamy or polyamorousness, or however we want to frame it, as a gender or an orientation. They may not see it as integral to who we are as people. And even people in the poly community, many, maybe even most, identify it as sort of a lifestyle, and it's sort of something that they're choosing to do. There are a lot of different opinions about that. I've asked a great many experts this very question. Myself, I have always felt like this resonates as being very true, that monogamy like our orientation and like our gender, likely operates on some sort of spectrum, and that many of us may be born to be monogamous, and that many of us certainly aren't. That's not necessarily how everybody feels, but I definitely appreciate where this writer is coming from. And to anybody who maybe hasn't encountered that idea, I guess I kind of just wanted to lay that out a little bit.
Right, and it can change over time as well.
Absolutely. It has that same level of maybe fluidity and like spectrumness that we see when we talk about our orientation, or at least that's certainly the model that I choose to view it from.
Yeah. Frank, what do you think about this?
Well, of course, I'm a biologist, and one of the things that comes to mind is our studies on monogamy in other species. There's a species of, well, two closely related species of meadow voles. These are mouse-like animals, and the one species is quite monogamous, and the other species is polyamorous. I don't know what you want to call it, but
Slutty.
But it was discovered that the monogamous species, both the males and the females, had very high blood levels of oxytocin. This is a hormone that normally is involved in precipitating childbirth. But it turned out that was the monogamy hormone, and when they found a way to inject oxytocin into the polyamorous species, they became monogamous. And there is actually a sort of a black market in oxytocin. I don't know. I've heard of this. I haven't seen it myself. Of guys who want a woman to fall in love just with him, and trying to find a way to get her to take oxytocin supplements.
Oh my goodness! I have not heard.
Are they extracting this from like the monogamize?
Monogamize. Hashtag monogamize.
Can I?
But I guess really what I am getting a long-winded way around saying is that probably feeling monogamous or the opposite is like everything else we are, is a chemical, is based on chemistry and physiology. And I don't know how this leads to any recommendations, but it just seems like realizing that there is a physiological basis for what we feel or don't feel is a place to start, and then try to figure out, okay, well, now how this relates to the problem of erectile dysfunction and that kind of thing, I don't know, but I will say that there's an enormous psychological dimension to that. And by the way, one of the episodes in my hypnosis memoir is called For a Lasting Erection.
This book has everything.
Literally everything.
I think there is value in at least validating, because I mean, throughout this letter, we hear the writer kind of go back and forth about, is this identity valid? He says that like the feeling that I'm non-monogamous didn't go away. I wrote it off as a fantasy. I was hoping I could go back to normal. And so I think that there is value in just acknowledging that, you know, our sexuality can be very fluid. It may shift, but it likely won't. This is probably a part of who you are. That does bring up the question of, well, what do we do about it, right?
Right.
And so, you know, as you said, if there are some workarounds, if there's an opportunity to have, you know, some fantasy fulfillment by flirting online, and, you know, he talks about it being immoral, and I want to acknowledge that. I don't know what the boundaries or what's been negotiated explicitly or implicitly in that relationship, but you know, while I recognize that it may well be immoral, and I always want to caution people about lying to their partner, as we talked about earlier, if this is what is necessary for you to stay in this relationship and stay sane, it may be permissible. That's a decision you're going to have to come to on your own.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like kind of echoing what you said as well. You said you went to a marriage counselor. Make sure that they're a secular one. Make sure there's someone that you can trust is giving you accurate information in an unbiased way. Because the way that you've described it, it doesn't feel like that's being done. It doesn't feel like you're being heard objectively. It sounds like there is a narrative that is being pushed on you. So maybe trying out another marriage counselor, somebody through the secular therapy website, for instance.
Yeah, which is a great network, admittedly small and may not have a therapist in your area. So that if that is the case, I would encourage you to just reach out to as many groups as you can. A place like Idaho, there may not be a lot of options, but I don't have the information off the top of my head, but I believe Idaho has relatively free borders in terms of online counseling, which may be an option worth considering. On top of that, looking at things like Open Path and Psychology Today and just these other avenues, even if you find somebody who appears to be secular, it might be worth reaching out with an email, sending something very much like this and just saying, like, this is who I am, and I'm not interested in being told that I'm just a horny teenager or, a dumb slut or however it's coming across. And having that conversation with your therapist before you even meet them as you're trying to find the right person. I guess the last thing that I want to make sure to add is that in talking about some of these workarounds and writing this fiction online, there may be some other ways to find that fantasy and that wish fulfillment. I don't know what your wife would be open to. I don't know what you would be interested in, but there's certainly ways to pursue these fantasies that don't necessarily involve having sex with others. Even something as simple as, role-playing as different people.
Yeah.
I know that can feel very silly, and it definitely doesn't sound like the type of sex life you have, but there are so many creative solutions and different things to look at, all while saying, this sounds really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I'm very sorry to hear it.
I know that you mentioned in your email as well that you downloaded the radar template that we mentioned on a previous show with Dedeker. And you're wondering how to implement that. I feel like the best way to go about that, if that's something you want to try to do, is implement it slowly and without saying where you got it from.
Yeah, maybe don't mention that it came from the Multi-Amory podcast about polyamory.
Right. It's a great practice just for
good communication.
People. Yeah. So broach it as, hey, I want to talk about your week. And I want to sit down and do this together in an intimate way once a week. And you don't have to talk about this stuff first. This doesn't have to be the first thing you bring up. It could be a month down the road. It could be a couple months down the road. Getting the two of you used to interacting with each other in that way and being honest and vulnerable in that protective, safe space, for lack of a better term.
That sounds like the biggest thing, is Frank was talking about earlier, just opening up the channels of communication, because all throughout this email, it feels very much like you feel your voice is being stifled. And if that is the case, then a tool like the Multi-Amory Radar, which we've featured on this show and we would very much encourage you to check out, can be really useful. My partner and I are currently in a monogamous relationship, and we sit down every month and go through that particular template. It doesn't need to be that tool, but just anything that's going to encourage open and active communication, I think, is only going to lead to the type of relationship that you want.
May I ask one thing? I'm always a little bit nervous when the word morality or immoral comes up. I mean, as secularists, we try to talk about ethics rather than morals.
Sure.
Morals are quintessentially religious constructs. But I think that to talk about the moral dimensions of how, in this case, probably what your levels of oxytocin are that you've been born with, is like discussing the moral dimensions of how much melanin pigment you were born with in your skin.
Which sadly we did for hundreds and hundreds of years, and thankfully do less and less. But hopefully that's the model moving forward.
Right. I think what Christy was getting to in terms of the potentially unethical portion of this would be the going behind his wife's back.
Yes, I understand.
Sure, and that's actually the term that the writer uses. So I would perhaps push back against that as well, because you're right. It is about the ethics of it. It is about like what is causing harm, not what imaginary sky creatures are telling us is how we should be.
Yeah.
Right. We hope this helps, Idaho. That's what we can give you for
Certainly
today.
Certainly a difficult place to be.
If you want to write in again with an update, if you decide to implement radar, or if you decide to have a conversation with your wife about coming to non-monogamy in a different way or using different paths, call in, send us another email. We'd love to continue this journey with you.
Absolutely.
All right. We are just about at the end of time, but Frank, I want to thank you so much for being on our show. This is one of my favorite episodes this season.
Well, I appreciate that. That's very high praise coming from someone like you. This has been really great, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate not only my being on your program, but how much I appreciate your having this program. It's been very clear to me for some while already that what you guys are doing is a really, really important task. And just from the few calls and the one email, it's clear there is a tremendous need there for you and for what you are doing. And I wish you all success.
Thank you. Thank you. I love doing this. This is my favorite part of the week. So if you guys watching either live or after we're done recording want to see more of Frank or read his book is available on Amazon. So you should go and pick out one of those. And then you can also go to YouTube, and Frank's channel is Frank Zindler. And he has a plethora of videos there. He's got some debates that he's done. He's got his own talk show where he sits down and discusses atheist-centric discussions and has some great guests on. So yeah, if you want to know more about Frank, check him out on YouTube and definitely buy his book.
And don't forget the music videos.
And the music
Rutabaga
videos.
Baby, Jesus Loves the Little Zygotes, Theophagy Tango, Gotta Get Saved Polka, and don't forget the Eunuch's Lament. That's my only country and Western composition.
Oh my goodness, yes. If your interest isn't piqued at this point, I don't know why.
Seriously, it's almost like we're just throwing darts at like a grab bag of fascinating topics. This feels more like a dinner party game than an actual conversation after a certain point.
Oh my goodness. And if you would like to follow Secular Sexuality, we are on Twitter at Secular Sex. If you want to call in and leave a voicemail, feel free to call our Ask line. That's 512-666-0-ASK. It's 512-666-0275. Or you can email us at sex@atheist-community.org. I'll remember all of that one day without writing it down. All right.
Okay, well, I guess we just want to thank all of you for watching and for calling in. Again, we would love to hear from you. Definitely want to thank our wonderful and talented crew for helping put all of this together and keep things going.
I'm your daddy. Worship me.
And for now, I suppose we just want to take a moment and encourage all of you out there to go and give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or, better yet, give somebody else one.
What are we doing, man? What are we doing?
no, you're done.